of this chapter the other day, and we discussed that how oral history project aims at recovering history, and we discussed how, for example, ethnic minorities, could have a lot many stories to tell, and lot many examples. In specific, we discussed the women guard, which was very active in Britain during World War II. So now the Summerfield, the writer of this particular chapter, she gives example. She kind of gives into details of how this project was carried out. Now, because there was not much documented record available about the women who participated in the Women Guard during the World War, therefore, they wanted to explore that through individual stories. Now let's look at the method they adopted. So they advertised in a magazine called Women's Weekly. And they put a kind of call for stories with these words: memories wanted. And they said, we are seeking men and women with memories of working in or assisting the Home Guard and Women's Home Defense in the Second World War. Please write or email me with your memories. Okay. And then they received like 24 responses from 24 women. So one response which is described over here is by Caitlin Wells, right? So she told the details about what was all about. And as she came up, a few members of the research group, they conducted interview with her in such a manner that they recorded the interview on a tape recorder. And it went on for like 2.5 hours. Now, in your case, or in our case, now this is 1990s, right? We have, more handy devices to record and save any interviews that we conduct, right? So we can do it just with our mobile, with a voice map, with a voice app we might have. Now, while the interview was recorded, the research group also transcribed the content of the interview. Why so? Because for oral historians, the transcription, the written text of the interview is very important. It is important because it stays in front of us, and we can visit it over and over again, as many times as we want. However, it has been recognized by experts in oral history, like this Italian oral historian called Alessandro Portelli. He points out that the voice is very important. So the oral historian should not depend just on the written transcript. Rather, they must listen to the interviewee's voice as well. So voice has in it a certain tone. There could be voice of desperation, optimism, anger, sadness, hope, so on and so forth. Sometimes the meaning of the sentence changes when you listen to it compared with its written transcript. And however, the written transcript is also very important. So, for example, uh, Summerly over here explains that through the written transcript, they were able to identify and classify various parts of the interview. For example, they could tell uh, what kind of information had been conveyed. Was the information about home guard only or women's home defense too, right? Uh, what was the uh, self-identification of the interviewee? Was she identifying herself as a male dominant character or a female dominated character? What kind of words she was using? You can do that qualitative data analysis by which you can tell how many times she used the expression of male dominance or strength or power. So, for example, use of the uh, words like gun, knife, fight, all of them will imply the interview's obsession with the tools of power, right? So if you have the written text in front of you, you can just do Control F and immediately come up with an analysis in terms of the repetitive use of certain words by the interviewee. By that, you can tell the obsession of the interviewee, the fears of the interviewee, and things of that kind, right? So whenever you plan for an oral history project and you interview somebody, you need both the transcript and the oral interview. So this research group come up with lot of information from Caitlin, and lot of that information was totally astonishing as well, right? For example, Caitlin learned to shoot. She worked in the home guard even if no woman was allowed to work on home guard. It was at a later stage in 1943 that the government allowed that. Okay, so they could come up with all that information just from the interview. That information was not available in published form anywhere else. Now, there are some objections to oral history method. Some of them are obvious. I'm sure many of you already might be thinking about those certain objections. One obvious objection is that of memory, right? To what extent the memory of the interviewee is really dependable. So, as I said earlier, the historian, here is one example of Hobsbawm, but then other historians as well, they were really, skeptic about the, role of memory in creating history. And they argue that you can create history only through the documented evidence. So you might have, disorganized pieces of notes here and there, and you can build up your record by organizing those notes, right? But still, even if you are organizing those chaotic notes into a historical narrative, still you are not basing your narrative on memory. Rather, you are basing your memory on, you are basing your narrative on documented evidence, right? But the other scholars, Trevor Lemis, one example is given, but you can look up more examples of oral historians. They, on the other hand, had a different argument. They said that human memory works through comparison. Also, as the time passes, as people age, the short-term memory reduces but the long-term memory becomes more reliable. Now, this was not an opinion. This was a scientific study of human mind, which told that the long-term memory of the individual strengthens with the age. Also, the long-term memory, in other words, the aged person has the advantage of comparing herself with other individuals. Now, if you look at both of these things, that is the ability of a mature individual to compare herself with other individuals. What does that have to do with dependability of memory? Through that kind of comparison with other individuals, the interviewee in an oral history adds credibility to what she or he is saying through the oral history. So other individuals that surround that old man or that old woman who is telling you the story of her life or the story of a genocide or the story of an earthquake or whatever, that person will use other individuals like their parents, their siblings, their friends. She or he will use them to build a context for the story. So the narrative of that individual will not be a stand-alone narrative. Rather, it will be a well-contextualized narrative. The real human beings will come in the story. The real human beings that surround that individual. Objective history does not do that, because objective history is, concerned with the documented evidence, something that is written. However, the oral history looks at the possibility of the immediate context that the interview develops. Oral history looks at that possibility of the context as dependability of memory. So when the person will speak with reference to, okay, this is what my dad said at that time. This is what my mom said at that time. This is what my siblings were doing at that time. This is what my sons and daughters, if that person had, were doing at that time, right? So there is a familial and friendly or a human in context to that story which is being told. And that is the context which makes the story more dependable and more reliable. So it is not one person's memory that we are dealing with in oral history. Rather, it is also the memory of other individuals to which this interview is referring, right? And then the other factor, the long-term memory, right? So the long-term memory is always more dependable for a reason probably you just understood from my previous comment. Because long-term memory has so many, time. Just a minute, please. The long-term memory has so many signposts to refer to, which may not be otherwise available. So all those signposts, for example, the person could tell you, the interview might tell you, okay, when this and this incident happened to her, okay, for example, she joined the Women Guard. That was the time when so and so was assassinated. Any person in history, right, was assassinated. So, so there is an immediate correlation, right? What's going on here?
Oh, damn.
Okay, so you can't listen music while taking the class. Anyways, okay, so all right, so so that these are the arguments which oral historian have, right? So those signposts, so the person would tell personal experience with reference to actual historical happening. So so and so was assassinated, or so and so became president of the country, or so and so became, you know, uh, um, so and so wrote a book and book was published, something of that kind, right? Okay, so this is the first objection, and I just presented to you there's, redressal of, those objections as well, right? Memory issue. The other major objection to oral history approach is that of validity and representativeness. So the those who object to, or who kind of have objections with oral history as a method, they would say that uh, probably the responses of one individual with whom you are conducting an interview cannot be treated as valid because they are not being tested against any objective truth. However, the oral historian, they use what we call triangulation. Okay, the word you can see on the screen. So they listen to the interviewee narrative, but then they also compare it with the documentary evidence which is available. Other documentary evidence. Now, the oral historian do not foreground the documentary evidence, right? They do not subject the oral history or oral interview to documentary evidence as such. Or still, in other words, they empower the oral history. They empower the oral history, but just as a methodological requirement, they also test the content of that oral history against the documentary evidence as well. For example, the historical narratives which are available, right? So the oral historian is not going to blindly trust the oral interviewee. Even if the oral historian will, you know, uh, with all attentiveness, listen to and record the content, but will not blindly trust the content of the interview. He will rather, or she will rather, verify it with other testimonies as well. This process is called triangulation, right? The other, related objection is that of representativeness. Is the uh, content of the interview of one individual, or maybe, in the case of this particular example that we're discussing, 24 participants, is the content of the interview of 24 participants out of total 32,000 actual members of Women Guard, is the content of 24 participants really true representation of the whole group? That is the next question, or that is the objection that uh, you know uh, some people might have about oral history as a method. Well, like all methods, oral history has its own limitations, right? To some extent, we understand that limitation. Well, yes, the oral history as a research method cannot take into account everything, you know, uh, which is true in the experiences of a particular group. However, there is something more valuable in oral history than the questionnaires in in a scientific or social scientific project. You know, in quantitative research, I'm sure many of you are aware of that, we have to uh, create and circulate questionnaires, and we try to reach out as big a population as it is possible. But the point in most of the questionnaires is this, that when we choose a population to seek responses on the questionnaire, we try to keep that population as broad as it is possible for us. Now, the responses that we get from the participants, those are highly objective responses because we get them in form of numbers. So there are 5 options, they have to click just one, take one of those options. And then as a researcher, we collect all those questionnaires, we look at the responses, we run statistical analysis, and through that analysis, we come up with a conclusion which is highly graphic conclusion and highly statistical conclusion in terms of numbers and digits and percentages. Now, this whole process kind of uh, reduces human, either reduces, rather almost totally, uh, you know, uh, uh, deprives the whole research process of the human element. There is no human element left in that, right? So there is objectivity in that, but the subjective element is totally lost. However, when it comes to oral history as a research method, I said earlier that there is more value in that. So where is value in those stories which people are just telling? There is value in those stories because through oral history, the researcher engages in a dialogue with an interviewee. So this is a two-way process. And through that dialogue, the researcher directs the memory of the interviewee in some unexpected directions so that the interviewee is able to not only provide responses to the question asked, but also interviewee is able to elaborate lot many things which cannot be done in the case of a questionnaire. In questionnaire, you are only ticking one option and there is no possibility of elaboration or gray areas. However, in the case of oral history, there is a lot of possibility of elaborations, details, gray areas, innovation, new stories coming up, right? So some people therefore call it a heuristic encounter in oral history. So it is not just a story being told, rather there is a lot of interpretation which is going on. The interpretation being done by the interviewee. So because we engage with an interviewee during oral history process, we engage with an interviewee as a human being, right? As a live human being with an active memory. Therefore, the view of an incident that we get from the interview is more holistic view of the reality. So that is the value that we come across in the case of oral history. And that value is missing in a social scientific research. Okay, now in the, so everything boils down to basically just one, activity, and that activity is that of conducting interviews. Now, there are certain dynamics to interviews that we conduct with an interviewee. So here is Caitlin's example. This has been narrated once again, uh, but to reduce it to some of the points, we have to take care of a few elements while conducting an interview of an individual. The first being, we need to research beforehand if the individual we are going to interview appropriately suits the area on which we are going to ask her or him question. The second thing, always do sufficient homework and prepare questions beforehand to ask the interviewee. Well, there could be some spontaneous questions too, but you can have relevant spontaneous questions only if you have pre-prepared questions as well. Number 3, you always need prior consent from the interviewee that clearly and explicitly indicates from the interviewee that she or he is going to give that interview for a research that will be published at a later stage. So prior consent for that is required. Number 4, you have to ask the interviewee if she or he is going to be treated anonymously or she or he would like to be named in the actual research. And finally, once you are done with the interview, you need a verification from the interviewee in terms of whether the content that you recorded has been accurately recorded. So you might have the transcript with you. You're supposed to share that transcript with the interviewee and ask her or him to give her or his consent or confirmation that the content in that particular interview has been recorded as per the intent of that interviewee. In other words, you have not misunderstood the interviewee. In fact, she or he meant the same thing as you have put down in the transcript. So these are 5 major, interview dynamics that you need to keep in mind while conducting, oral history interview or interview for oral history. Okay, so to sum it up all, oral history is a research method in which we record the interviews of certain individuals in order to recover any lost segment of history or missing segment of history. Okay, so please note that any general interview cannot be oral history. For example, you interview a celebrity or you interview a major writer or you interview an expert on the field. Those are not oral histories. The essential component of oral history project is that you identify an ignored, lost, missed, deleted, segment of history which is not documented yet, right? And you as a researcher is the first person or almost the first person to notice the absent segment of history, right? And then based upon that, you must identify an individual who has direct experience with that chunk of history, right? You interview that particular individual, you record the findings of that particular individual, the story of that particular individual, and then you analyze that story to tell how and in what way the this segment of history or a particular segment of history was ignored. So you can basically take the read some of the examples which your classmates have shared, especially the example related to um, related to the partition, because it is easier for you to relate with that. Okay, it's not that you are going to do it's not that you are going to do uh, partition research necessarily, but at least you should be able to see or read an example of how oral history works, right? So while you are reading that, think in terms of the